Welcome to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight's story is called The Wild Swans, a quiet fairy tale of love, endurance, and promises kept. So settle in and let the story begin. Far away, in a kingdom where the mornings often began in silver mist, and the evening settled softly over the roofs like folded blue velvet, there once lived a king who had 11 sons and 1 little daughter. His daughter was called Eliza. Before sorrow ever entered their lives, before enchantment and silence and long roads through dark forest, there was a time when the world felt whole to them. It wasn't a perfect world, because no world truly is, but it was warm in the way childhood can be warm, when love is still the shape of the walls around you, and the sound of familiar footsteps in the hall can make you feel safe, without even knowing why. The king's castle stood on a rise above a lake that held the sky so clearly that at dawn the water seemed to wake before the land did. White swans often drifted across it in the early light. Pine woods circled the farther shore, and beyond them were fields, small villages, old roads, and the long, quiet country that belonged to the crown. Inside the castle, there were great chambers with carved beams darkened by years of firelight, long corridors softened by woven runners, and the tall windows that looked east toward the water. In winter, candles glowed behind every pane like rows of patient stars. In summer, the windows stood open to the scent of the green leaves and the rain-washed earth. The 11 princes had been born one after another, so close in age that they seemed almost like one bright, laughing company rather than separate boys. Yet, each had his own face, his own way of moving through the world, his own voice in the lively music of the household. Some were bold and quick to race down the steps, 2 at a time. Some were thoughtful, stopping to watch the clouds gather over the lake or to listen to the old gardener speak of weather and birds. One loved horses best. Another would sit by the fire and shape little animals from bits of wood shaved smooth with a careful knife. One remembered every song he heard, and another had a gift for making even solemn servants hide a smile. And among them all moved Eliza, the youngest, the smallest, and in certain ways the heart of them. She wasn't loud, though she laughed easily. She was not timid, though she was gentle. And even as a child, she had a quiet steadiness about her, and if she listened not only to what people said, but what they meant, her hair fell soft and fair over her shoulders, and her eyes had that clear, attentive look that made people speak more kindly in her presence. Her brothers adored her. If the princes were sent to their lessons, one or another would glance back before disappearing through the schoolroom door, just to see whether Eliza was still in the corridor. If there were ripe berries in the kitchen garden, or the first hazelnuts of autumn, or a ribbon dropped from some festival trimming, it was brought to her, because no pleasure was complete until shared with their sister. In the evenings, when supper was done and the castle quieted into its gentler sounds, the children often gathered in the old nursery that had long ago belonged to the king himself. The room was high and warm, with a deep hearth, faded wall hangings, and shelves where worn books leaned shoulder to shoulder. A nurse with a soft lap and a patient voice would mend linen by the fire, while one prince read aloud, stumbling solemnly over long words until the others burst into laughter. Then another would seize the book and insist he could do better. Eliza loved those hours best. She liked the fire when it had burned low and red, liked the hush between one page and the next, like the wind brushing at the window panes while everyone inside was safe and golden in the candlelight. Sometimes she would sit on the rug with her cheek against one brother's knee while another braided a narrow strip of rushes into the ring of her finger. Sometimes she would grow drowsy and lean against the eldest, listening as stories of distant countries floated over her like warm water. There were little ceremonies to their life together, the kind that seemed small at the time and precious only later. In the morning, the princess crossed the great hall with books beneath their arms and bent to kiss Eliza's hair as if out of habit. On cold afternoons, they walked the covered paths near the courtyard and let her place her mittened hands into theirs. On feast days, when music drifted up from below and the castle smelled of roasted apples, bread, cloves, and pine boughs, they made room for her among them, as though it were impossible to imagine the circle closed without her. Even the king, burned as he was with matters of council, harvest, roads, disputes, and treaties, softened when he came among his children. He loved them truly. That much must be said, though he was often occupied at times and wore the faraway expression of one whose thoughts are not his own, even for a single hour. He would still pause to lay a hand on his son's shoulder or draw Eliza close for a brief and absent-minded kiss. He would ask after lessons, after riding, after music. He would listen to their chatter with weary fondness of a father who takes comfort where he can find it. Yet, there was also an emptiness in that castle, though the children did not at first understand. Their mother was gone. Her portrait still hung in a quiet chamber where afternoon light touched the painted edge of her sleeve and the pearls at her throat. Fresh flowers were often set beneath it in the summer, and in winter there might only be evergreen cuttings, a few holly leaves, or a dish of dried lavender to keep the room from feeling too bare. The children had learned, each in a different way, to live around the absence. But absence is a tender thing. It leaves space. And sometimes, in the stillness after laughter, when the candles were burning low and the lake outside reflected a pale moon through the window glass, it seemed as if the castle itself were holding its breath. The days were beautiful then, but beauty is no promise. A home may be warm and yet not know what is already on its way. The children could not have guessed how near their happiness stood to its ending. They didn't know that the roads leading toward the castle even now carried change with them. They didn't know that love, once tested, would ask everything of them. They knew only the sweetness of those early years, the firelight, the lake, the woods, the clasp of familiar hands. And because they did not know, they were able, for a little while longer, to be entirely at peace. It was not long after those gentle years that the first quiet change came. At first, it didn't feel like change at all. The king began to travel more often, or so it seemed to the children. Messengers came and went with greater urgency. The long table in the council chamber was more frequently set with maps and sealed letters. There were conversations that ended with small footsteps approaching and doors that closed more softly, but more often than before. Then one evening, as the light faded early and the air carried the first thin edge of autumn, word spread through the castle that the king would soon return, and that he would not return alone. The household stirred with a different kind of energy. Fresh rushes were laid along the floors, tapestries were beaten free of dust and rehung, candles were trimmed and replaced in their holders. In the kitchens, great pots simmered from dawn until dusk, and the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine drifted through the corridors. Servants moved quickly, but with certain care, and though preparing not only for the arrival, but for judgment. The children watched all of this with curiosity. They had heard, in the way children hear such things, that their father had taken a new wife. The word itself felt strange to Eliza. A queen. She did not yet know what it would mean. She only knew that it would be different, that someone new would walk the halls where her mother's memory still lingered, in a small and quiet way. On the day of arrival, the sky lay pale and still over the lake, and the wind moved only lightly through the tops of the trees. The children were brought to the great hall and asked to stand in line, from the eldest to the youngest. Eliza stood near the end, her small hand tucked into the sleeve of a brother beside her. The doors opened. First came the king, travel-worn but upright, his cloak edged with the dust of the road, and beside him, walking, with a measured and graceful step, came the new queen. She was very beautiful. That was the first thing anyone would have said. Her gown fell in deep, rich folds, the color of dark leaves after rain. Her hair was arranged with careful precision, and a slender circlet rested lightly against her brow. Her face was pale, but not with weakness, rather with a stillness that gave her an air of calm control, as though she did not often yield to the moment, but held herself slightly apart from it. When she smiled, it was gentle. When she spoke, her voice was smooth and even. And yet, there was something in her gaze that did not quite rest. It moved lightly and quickly from one child to another, measuring without seeming to measure, noting without seeming to note. It didn't linger, and yet it missed nothing. The king called the children forward. One by one, they bowed. The eldest spoke first, offering a careful greeting. The others followed, each in turn, some steady, some shy, some glancing briefly up before lowering their eyes again. When it was Eliza's turn, she stepped forward and curtsied, just as she had been taught. For a brief moment, the queen's gaze settled fully upon her. Eliza felt it, not as something sharp, but as something cool, like stepping into water that is colder than expected. She lifted her eyes for only a second, and in that second, she saw not unkindness exactly, but distance, a kind of quiet refusal. The queen's smile didn't change. "Well," she said softly, "such a large family and a lively family." Her hand rested lightly on Eliza's head, though the touch itself was brief. "Children bring much noise to a household," she added, almost thoughtfully. The king laughed, as though it were a light remark, and drew her further into her hall. That evening, there was a feast. Music filled the lower chambers, and torches flickered along the walls, their light dancing across polished surfaces and bright fabrics. The children sat together, as they always had, but something in the air felt different. Less like a circle, more like a line that had been gently drawn between what was and what would be. The queen spoke little during the meal. She listened. She watched. When one of the younger princes laughed too loudly, her eyes shifted, just slightly. When two others began to whisper together, her gaze moved again. It was never harsh, never openly displeased, but it was present in a way that made even the boldest among them grow a little quieter without fully understanding why. Eliza noticed it most in the spaces between things, and the way the servants stood a little straighter, and the way the candles seemed to burn more steadily, as though even the air had stilled to accommodate her. In the way her father, when he turned toward his new queen, seemed both pleased and distant somehow, as if part of him were already yielding to her presence in ways he did not yet recognize. Days passed, then weeks. At first the changes were small. The children were sent more often to their lessons and kept there longer. The hours in the nursery grew fewer. The doors to certain rooms were closed, not with force, but with quiet finality. The laughter that had once echoed easily along the corridors began to soften, then to thin. The queen didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her wishes were expressed with calm certainty, and they were carried out without question. The princes found themselves corrected for things that had once passed unnoticed. Boots left near a door were quietly removed. Books left open were closed and taken away. Games that spilled from one room into another were gently, but firmly, ended. Nothing seemed cruel, and yet everything seemed changed. Eliza felt it most keenly in the absence of ease. Where she once had moved through the castle without thinking, she now paused before entering a room, uncertain whether she was meant to be there. Where once she would have spoken freely, she now found herself holding back, listening first, measuring her words in ways she had never needed to before. Her brothers tried, in their different ways, to keep things as they had been. They still brought her small treasures when they could. They still gathered in quiet corners when the day allowed it. But even these moments felt thinner now, and though they were being held together against something that pressed steadily and silently from all sides. And sometimes, in the evenings, when the light had faded and the castle settled into its deeper quiet, Eliza would stand by the window and look out across the lake. The swans were still there. They moved across the water in pale, unhurried lines, their reflections wavering soft beneath them. The forest beyond remained dark and steady. The wind moved through it in long, slow breaths. The world outside had not changed, only the world within. And though Eliza could not yet name the feeling that had begun to grow in her chest, she knew, in a quiet way that children sometimes know such things, that the warmth of her earlier days was beginning, very gently, to fade. The change, when it finally came, did not arrive with noise. It came quietly in the early hours of a morning that seemed, at first, like any other. A pale light lay across the lake, thin as silk. The sky had not yet taken on its full color, and the castle still held that soft hush that belongs only to the moments before the day begins in earnest. In the corridors, candles had burned low. In the courtyards, the air was cool and still. Eliza woke with the faint sense that something was different. She didn't know what it was, only that the morning felt unsettled, as though a familiar rhythm had broken during the night, and the world had not quite found its way back again. She rose and dressed, moved quietly so as not to wake the others who slept nearby. The stones beneath her feet were cool. Somewhere far off she heard the low murmur of voices, not the easy, unguarded voices of servants beginning their work, but something softer, more careful. When she stepped into the corridor, she saw at once that it was not as it should be. 2 servants stood near the far end, speaking in hushed tones. When they noticed her, they fell silent. "Eliza," one of them said gently, though his voice carried a strain she had never heard before. "You should return to your chamber." "My brothers," she said at once, her heart beginning to move faster. "Where are they?" The servants exchanged a glance. "They are not to be disturbed just now." The answer did not soothe her. It deepened the unease rising within her. Without waiting for permission, she turned and hurried down the corridor, her steps light but quick, her breath coming a little faster with each passing moment. She knew the way to her brother's rooms without thinking. She had walked it 100 times, laughing, calling ahead, sometimes racing to be the first to knock. Now she reached the door and found it closed. That too was wrong. It was never closed to her. She lifted her hand and pushed it open. The room beyond was empty. The beds were undisturbed as though they had not been slept in. The blankets lay smooth, the pillows untouched. The windows stood open and the morning air drifted in, carrying with it the scent of water and distant trees. For a moment, Eliza simply stood there. The silence in the room felt too large. "My brothers," she called softly. No answer came. She moved forward, her fingers brushing the edge of a table, the back of a chair, as though the familiar shapes might anchor her to something certain. But everything felt strangely distant, as if the room itself no longer belonged to the life she had known. Then faintly, from beyond the window, she heard it. A sound like wings, not the soft occasional flutter of birds that had often passed over the lake, but something stronger, fuller, a beating of air that seemed to gather and rise all at once. Eliza turned. She went to the window and leaned out. Above the water, just beyond the slope of the hill, a great movement filled the sky. Swans, not one or two, but many. They rose together from the edge of the lake, their white wings catching the pale light of the morning. For a moment, they seemed almost to glow, as though the dawn itself had taken shape and lifted into the air. Eliza's breath caught. There was something in the way they moved, something not wild, not distant, but familiar in a way she could not yet understand. She watched as they circled above the water, their wings steady, their bodies turning in a slow, graceful arc. Then, as though guided by a single thought, they began to fly outward, away from the castle, toward the line of dark trees that marked the far edge of the world she knew. "No," she whispered, though she did not know why. She ran. Down the corridor, through the turning stair, across the great hall where the door still stood open from the night before. Her steps echoed now, sharp against the stone, breaking the quiet that had settled over everything. Outside, the air struck cool against her face. She didn't stop. She ran across the courtyard past the still fountain, through the narrow gate that led toward the path descending to the lake. Her breath came fast now, her heart beating hard against her ribs as though it had already understood what her mind had not yet found the shape to hold. When she reached the water's edge, the swans were already far out over the lake. They moved in a long, pale line, their wings rising and falling in the rhythm that seemed both powerful and unhurried. The surface of the water trembled beneath them, catching fragments of their reflection, breaking and reforming with each passing moment. "Eliza?" The voice came from behind her. She turned. The queen stood at the top of the path, her figure still and composed against the gray of the morning. Her dark gown moved only slightly in the breeze, and her hands were folded before her, as though this was any ordinary moment. "You should not run so carelessly," she said. Eliza stared at her. "My brothers," she said, her voice unsteady now. "Where are they?" The queen's gaze followed the line of swans as they moved farther and farther away. "Gone," she said simply. Eliza shook her head. "No." A faint smile touched the queen's lip. Not warm, not kind, but quiet and certain. "They have taken the form that suits them best," she said. "Wild creatures, restless, untamed. It's fitting, do you not think?" Eliza's hands trembled at her side. "You've done this?" she said. It wasn't a question. The queen didn't answer at once. Instead, she stepped forward, slowly, until she just stood a little nearer, close enough that Eliza could see the calm steadiness in her eyes. No anger, no haste, no doubt. "Children," she said softly, "must sometimes be guided. A household cannot remain in disorder forever. Eliza felt something inside her shift then. Not break. Not yet. But change. Fear was there. But beneath it, something steadier began to rise. "They are not yours to change," she said, though her voice was quiet. The queen regarded this for a long moment. "No," she said at last, "but you are still here." The words settled heavily in the air between them. Eliza turned back toward the lake. The swans were smaller now, their bright forms fading into the distance, becoming no more than the pale shapes against the widening light of the morning sky. She watched them until her eyes blurred, until she could no longer tell where they ended and where the sky began. And still she stood there, unmoving, as the wind lifted gently from the water and passed around her, carrying with it the last faint echo of wings. The world had not grown louder. It had grown quieter, as though something living and bright had been taken from it, and though Eliza did not yet know what would be required of her, or how far she would have to go, or how long she would have to endure, she knew this, with certainty, that settled deep within her. She would not forget them. Not the sound of their voices, not the warmth of their hands, not the way they had filled the world around her with life. Even if they had been carried beyond her reach, even if the path ahead was dark, she would follow. In whatever way she could, she would follow. Time, after that morning, did not pass as it once had. It no longer moved in warm, familiar patterns of lessons and laughter, of shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire. Instead, it stretched and thinned, each day unfolding with a stillness that felt watchful, as though the castle itself had grown cautious of what might come next. For a little while, Eliza remained. She moved through the halls as she always had, though more quietly now, as though careful not to disturb something unseen. The places that had once held the easy rhythm of her brother's presence now felt too large, too empty. The nursery was seldom used. The corridors echoed differently. Even the great hall seemed to hold its breath, as though remembering what had been lost. The king spoke little of it. When Eliza asked, he answered gently, but without clarity, as though the truth lay just beyond his reach. He spoke of distant lands, of change, of things that must be accepted. His voice was kind, but it carried a quiet distance that had not been there before. And the queen watched. She did not speak of the princes at all. Her attention rested instead on Eliza. Not always directly, not with harshness, but with a steady, quiet focus that made Eliza feel as though she were being measured against something unseen. "You are no longer a child," the queen said one evening as they walked together along the covered gallery that overlooked the lake. The air was cool, and the last light of day rested in soft bands across the water. "You must learn to carry yourself accordingly." Eliza did not answer. She had begun to understand her words held little weight here. Still, something within her remained steady. The same quiet strength that had always been part of her now settled more deeply, as though taking root. Days later, the decision was made. It was spoken as if something necessary, something proper, something for Eliza's own good. She would be sent away. "To be raised as befits her station," the queen said, her voice calm, her expression unchanged. The king agreed. Whether from weariness or uncertainty or some influence he did not fully resist, Eliza could not know, only that the decision, once spoken, was not undone. And so, on a morning veiled in a soft gray mist, Eliza left the castle. There was no ceremony, no gathering of voices, only the quiet preparation of a small carriage the careful folding of her few belongings, and the low murmur of servants who did not quite meet her eyes. She paused once at the edge of the courtyard. The stones beneath her feet were still damp with early dew. The windows above reflected the pale sky. Somewhere within those walls were the rooms that had held her entire world. She looked toward the lake. The water lay still. For a moment, she thought she saw a white shape moving far out near the far shore, but the mist shifted, and it was gone. Then she stepped into the carriage. The road carried her away, through the outer gates, beyond the low stone walls, into the long quiet of the countryside. The journey passed in a gentle blur of fields and forest, of distant cottages and narrow roads that curved out of sight before they could be followed. The sound of wheels over earth and stone settled into a steady rhythm, one that might have soothed her once. Now, she simply listened. She didn't cry, not because she didn't feel the loss, but because something in her had grown still in the face of it, as though her heart, unable to hold the full weight of what had been taken, had chosen instead to carry it quietly. At last, they came to a place that would be her new home. It was not unkind. There were gentlewomen there, and rooms that were neat and orderly, and gardens that held their own quiet beauty. The days were structured, the expectations clear. Eliza was given what she needed, but it was not hers. The air didn't carry the same familiar scent. The walls didn't remember her laughter. The evenings did not gather in the same warm way around a shared fire. And always, beneath the surface of each passing day, there remained an absence. Years moved quietly forward. Eliza grew. Her hair lengthened, her features softened into the calm grace of early womanhood. Her hands learned skill and patience. Her voice, when she used it, was gentle and measured. But within her, the memory of her brothers did not fade. If anything, it deepened. Sometimes, in the early morning, before the others had risen, she would walk beyond the garden walls and stand at the edge of the trees. She would listen to the wind moving through the branches, to the distant calls of the birds waking the day. And always, she wondered where they had gone, whether they still lived, whether somewhere beneath feathers and sky and distance they still remembered her. It was during one of these quiet mornings that the change came again. She had gone farther than usual that day, drawn by a feeling she could not fully name. The forest opened before her in long, shadowed paths, the ground soft beneath her feet, the air cool and filled with the scent of moss and damp leaves. She walked without haste, listening, watching. And then she heard it, a sound like wings. Her breath stilled. She lifted her gaze. Above the trees, moving across the pale light of the morning sky, came a line of white swans. They flew in a slow, steady formation, their wings rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to echo something deep within her chest. Not hurried, not lost, guided. Eliza stepped forward, her eyes fixed on them. They passed overhead close enough now that she could see the shape of each wing, the curve of each neck. For a moment, just a moment, one of them turned, and in that turning, something within her knew. Not with certainty, and not with proof, but with a recognition that needed neither. "My brothers," she whispered. The word did not break the quiet. It settled into it. The swans moved on, gliding toward the distant line where the forest met open land. Eliza did not hesitate. She followed. At first, her steps were careful, measured. The path beneath her was uneven, the way uncertain. But as the trees began to thin and the light widened ahead, her pace quickened. She moved through the forest and out into the open, where the land sloped gently toward a distant shore. The lake lay there once more, not the same lake she had known as a child, but something in its stillness, its wide, quiet surface, felt like an echo of that earlier place. The swans descended. One by one, they lowered themselves to the water, their wings folding, their bodies settling into the gentle motion of the lake. Eliza stood at the edge of the shore. The wind moved softly around her. The water reflected the pale sky. And before her, just beyond her reach, the swans drifted. She didn't call out. Not yet. She only watched, her hands still at her sides, her breath slow and steady. As though, after all this time, she had finally come to the edge of something that would not turn away. And in the quiet space between one moment and the next, she knew. She'd found them, or at least, she had found the path that would lead her back. Eliza didn't call out to them. Not at first. She stood at the edge of the shore, her breath slow, her hands still at her sides, as though the moment itself required quiet in order to remain. The swans drifted across the water, not hurried, not distant, but near enough now that she could see the soft layering of their feathers, the gentle turning of their long necks, and the steady awareness in their dark eyes. They saw her. She felt it, not with certainty, but with something deeper than certainty. Recognition. "My brothers," she said softly. The words seemed to settle over the water rather than travel across it. And yet, they were heard. A movement passed between the swans. They drew closer. Then, as the day began to lean toward evening, and the light softened into gold and pale gray, the air itself seemed to grow still. The lake quieted. The wind softened. And before her eyes, the swans began to change. It was not sudden, not sharp, but gentle, as though each of them were remembering the shape that they had once held. Wings folded inward, feathers gave way, and one by one her brothers stood before her again, barefoot at the water's edge, pale with distance and time, but unmistakable. For a moment, no one moved. Then Eliza stepped forward, and they came to her. They gathered around her, their arms closing around her shoulders, her hands, her back, as though they feared she might vanish if they held her too lightly. "Eliza, you found us. We thought—" The words broke and softened and fell away. They didn't need them. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the warmth of them, the living, human warmth she had carried in memory through every quiet morning, every uncertain day. They were here. After a time, they drew back, though not far. The eldest looked at her gently. "We cannot remain like this for long," he said. Eliza held his gaze. "I know," she answered, though she had only just begun to understand. "By day we are bound to the sky," he continued. "We must fly as swans from the first light until evening falls. Only then may we return to our lives. And even then, only until the night deepens." Eliza slowly nodded. "And where do you go?" she asked. The brothers exchanged a quiet glance. "Far," one of them said. "Across waters beyond forests, we cannot always choose where the wind carries us." Another added softly, "But we return here when we can." Eliza looked out across the lake. The place felt already set apart, quiet, removed from the rest of the world, as though it existed just beyond the reach of ordinary paths. "You must come with us," the eldest said then. She looked back at him. "How?" He gestured toward the water. As the last of the evening light settled over the lake, the brothers stepped back, and their forms began to shift once more. Arms became wings, Voices faded into silence, and in their place the swans stood again. But this time they did not move away. Instead, several of them came close to the shore. One by one they lowered themselves into the water, their bodies steady, their wings slightly lifted. Eliza understood. Not through words, but through trust. She stepped forward. The water was cold at first, but not harsh. The surface parted gently around her as she moved closer, reaching out. One of the swans bent low beside her. Carefully, so carefully, she placed her hands upon his wings. The feathers were smooth and strong beneath her fingers. Another swan moved beside the first, then another. Together, they formed a quiet, living support. Eliza allowed herself to lean into them, to be held, to be carried. They did not rush. They moved slowly across the water, their wings steady, their bodies guiding her with a strength that did not feel wild, but certain. The lake opened before them. The shore grew distant behind. The sky deepened into evening, and Eliza, held gently between them, was carried across. When at last they reached the far side, the land rose in a narrow stretch of earth, an island, quiet and untouched, ringed by low grasses and shadowed trees. The swans guided her to the shore. She stepped onto the ground. The air there felt different, still, as though the island held its own silence separate from the world beyond the water. As night settled, the swans came ashore once more, and once more they changed. Her brother stood before her again. "This is where we return," the eldest said, "as often as we can." Eliza looked around. The island was simple. No shelter but the trees, no fire, no walls, only the quiet presence of earth and water and sky. And yet, it didn't feel empty. It felt held. "What must I do?" she asked. There was no hesitation now, only readiness. The brothers grew still. The eldest spoke. "There is a way to break the enchantment," he said, "but it will require more of you than we ever would wish to ask." Eliza met his gaze. "You need not ask," she said quietly. "Only tell me." For a moment, something softened in his expression. Then he continued. "You must gather the stinging nettles that grow in the deepest parts of the forest," he said, "or among the old burial grounds where the earth has not been disturbed." Eliza listened. "You must take them in your hands," he said. "Though they will burn your skin, you may crush them, soften them, and spin them into thread." Her fingers curled slightly at her sides. "And from that thread," he said, "you must weave shirts, one for each of us." Eliza nodded. "And when they're finished?" she asked. "They must be placed upon us," he said, "each one before the rising of the sun." The wind moved softly through the trees. "There is one more thing," he added. Eliza waited. "You must not speak," he said quietly. "Not a single word from the moment you begin until the last shirt is finished." The stillness deepened. "If you speak," he continued, "even once, all that you have done will be undone, and we will remain as we are." Eliza felt the weight of it settle within her. The forest, the nettles, the long hours, the silence, and then her brothers. "I will do it," she said. The answer came without hesitation. The eldest stepped closer. "It will not be easy," he said. "I know. There will be pain. I know. You will have to endure it alone." Eliza did not look away. "I have endured before," she said softly. "This has purpose." The brothers understood. They came closer once more, standing with her in the quiet of the island, the night deepening gently around them. Then after a moment, one of her younger brothers stepped forward. He hesitated slightly, as though uncertain whether to speak. "I will remain with you as long as I can," he said. Eliza looked at him. A small, quiet warmth moved through her. "Thank you," she said. The night settled. The stars rose, and soon the time given to them began to close. One by one, her brothers stepped back. Their forms shifted once more. Once again, they became swans. They moved toward the water, then lifted into the night. All but one. The youngest lingered a moment longer beside her, his gaze steady, his presence quiet, but sure. Then he, too, turned, and the sky received them. Eliza stood alone on the island. The water lay dark and still. The forest waited beyond. The task had been given. The path had begun. And though the night stretched long before her, she did not feel lost. She stepped forward, and in the silence that would now become her companion, she began. The forest received her without resistance. It did not welcome her, exactly, but neither did it turn her away. Eliza stepped from the narrow edge of the island into the deeper path that led beyond the water, her feet moving carefully over the soft ground, her hands brushing lightly against the branches as she passed. The air was cool, shaded, carrying the scent of earth and leaves and something older, something that had been growing long before she arrived. Behind her, the lake lay still. Before her, the forest opened. She didn't hurry. There was no need. The task had already begun the moment she said yes. The path was not clearly marked, but it didn't feel uncertain. It wound beneath trees whose trunks rose tall and steady, their bark darkened by time, their branches woven together high above, allowing only thin strands of light to reach the ground below. In those quieter places, the air grew cooler. The sounds softened. Even the birds seemed to speak more gently. Eliza walked until the light began to shift toward evening again. Though here, beneath the trees, it was difficult to tell how much time had passed. The forest held its own rhythm, slower, deeper, untouched by the hurried movements of the world beyond it. At last she came upon the place where the ground dipped slightly inward, forming a shallow hollow between the roots of the several old trees. There, set into the earth itself, was an opening of a small cave. It wasn't large, not grand, but it was sheltered. The stone around the entrance was smooth in places, worn by time or weather, or perhaps by the quiet passing of others who had once stood where she now stood. Eliza paused. She looked at the cave, then at the trees, then back again. It would be enough. She stepped inside. The air within was cool and still. The space narrowed slightly as it curved inward, but not so much that it felt confining. There was room enough to sit, to rest, to work. She gathered a few fallen branches from just outside and brought them in. With careful hands she arranged them near the entrance, where the light could still reach. It wasn't a fire, not yet, but it marked the beginning of something lived in, something shaped by her presence. This would be her place, for however long it would take. As evening settled, she stepped once more outside. The forest had grown dim. The first traces of night moved quietly between the trees, softening edges, deepening shadows. It was time. She searched for them where her brothers had said they would be, in the darker places, where the ground was undisturbed, where the light didn't linger. She found them near the base of the cluster of stones, half hidden beneath low growth. Nettles. At first, they didn't seem remarkable. Thin stems, serrated leaves, soft, almost delicate in their appearance. But Eliza knew. She knelt beside them. For a moment, she simply looked, not in hesitation, but in understanding. Then slowly, she reached out her hand. The first touch was sharp, a sudden, stinging heat that spread across her skin faster than she expected. It wasn't unbearable, but it was immediate, insistent, impossible to ignore. Her breath caught. Her fingers tightened slightly, but she did not pull away. Instead, she closed her hand around the stems. The sting deepened, moved, spread, and still she held. One by one, she gathered them, carefully, deliberately. Each touch brought the same sharp burn. Each movement carried the same quiet test of will. But the rhythm began to settle. Reach, hold, gather, place, again, and again, and again. By the time she returned to the cave, her hands were marked with it, reddened, sensitive, alive with the lingering heat of what she had taken upon herself. She sat near the entrance where the last of the light still reached. For a moment, she did nothing, only breathed, only allowed the feeling to move through her without resistance. Then she began. She crushed the nettles as best she could, working them carefully between her fingers, breaking down their shape, softening them into something that could be shaped again. It was slow work, unfamiliar. Her hands were not yet skilled at it, but they learned. Little by little, the fibers began to separate, to lengthen, to hold together in new ways. She worked in silence, not because she was forced to, not yet, but because the silence had already begun to take its place around her. It didn't feel empty. It felt full, as though each moment, each breath, each small act of persistence carried its own quiet meaning. The light faded. Night settled. The forest grew still. From beyond the trees, faintly, so faintly she may have imagined it, she heard the distant sounds of wings, her brothers, returning. She didn't rise. She didn't call out. She continued to work. Her fingers moved slowly, steadily, shaping the fibers into something finer, something more deliberate. The pain in her hands didn't vanish, but it did change. It became something she could carry, something that no longer surprised her, but moved with her, part of the work itself. Time passed. She didn't measure it. There was no need. There was only the next movement, the next thread, the next breath. And though she was alone, she didn't feel abandoned. The forest held her. The cave sheltered her. The task guided her. And somewhere beyond the darkness, her brothers lived. That was enough. She worked until her hands grew tired, until the first fragile strands of thread lay before her, uneven, but real. A beginning. She looked at them for a moment, not with pride, not with doubt, but with quiet recognition. This was how it would be, slow, steady, endured. She drew her hands back, resting them gently on her lap. The night had deepened. The air was cool. The world was quiet in a way that felt complete. Eliza closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to rest. Only for a little while. Tomorrow, she would gather more. Tomorrow, she would continue. And in that simple, steady promise, something within her settled. She had begun, and she would not stop. Morning came gently to the forest, not all at once, but in quiet layers. The sky lightened behind the trees, shadows softened along the ground, and the first birds began to stir, their voices returning one at a time until the stillness of night slowly gave way to the rhythm of a new day. Eliza was already awake. She had not slept long, only rested in stillness, her back against the cool stone of the cave, her hands folded loosely in her lap. The faint sting in her fingers had settled into something quieter now, not gone, but changed into a steady warmth that no longer surprised her. For a few moments, she remained where she was, listening. The forest didn't rush, and she began to understand that she did not need to rush either. At last, she rose and stepped outside. The morning light filtered softly through the trees, falling in narrow strands across the ground. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth, leaves, and distant water. She looked toward the lake. The swans were gone. She did not search for them. She understood now how it worked, how they belonged to the sky, and by day they would return only when the evening came. Turning back toward the deeper forest, she began her work again. She walked farther than she had the day before, moving with a quiet purpose that had already begun to settle into her steps. The path wasn't clear, but she no longer needed it to be. She followed the shaded places, the stillness, the ground that felt untouched. There, among stones and low growth, she found the nettles again. This time, she did not hesitate as long. She knelt and reached for them. The sting came just as before, sharp, immediate, and spreading quickly across her skin. Her breath caught, and for a moment, her fingers tightened, but she did not draw back. Instead, she continued, gathering them one by one with careful, deliberate movements. Her hands began to remember. The rhythm returned more easily now, reaching, holding, gathering, placing. Each motion followed, without hurry, without resistance. When she returned to the cave, her hands were marked again, reddened and sensitive, but she did not dwell on the discomfort. She sat near the entrance where the light still reached and began her work. She crushed the nettles slowly, working them between her fingers, separating the fibers as best she could. The process was unfamiliar, but it was no longer uncertain. The strands began to form again, uneven but stronger than before. Time passed without measure. The light shifted across the ground and then slipped away. The air warmed and cooled again. The forest remained steady around her. She didn't speak, not even to herself. The silence had changed. It no longer felt like something outside of her, but something she carried within her, as natural as her breath or a steady movement of her hands. By late afternoon, she had gathered more than the day before. It was not enough, but it was progress, and that was what mattered. She rose slowly and stepped outside once more. The air had changed. At first, she couldn't have said how, but after a moment, she felt it. A subtle disturbance, something moving through the stillness that did not belong to the wind or weather. Then she heard it, the distant sound of hooves. It came faintly at first, then more clearly, measured and steady, drawing nearer through the trees. Eliza remained where she was. She didn't hide. She didn't retreat. She simply waited. Through the shifting light and shadow, figures began to appear. Men on horseback, moving carefully with purpose. Their presence felt different from the quiet rhythm of the forest, but not violent, only human. At the center rode a man whose presence set him apart. He was not dressed in excess, nor did he carry himself with display, but there was a quiet authority in the way the others moved around him, in the space they gave without being told. A king? Eliza knew it at once. The horses slowed as they reached the clearing, and after a moment, the king dismounted and stepped forward. He approached her without haste, as one might approach something not fragile, but worthy of care. "You are far from any road," he said. His voice was calm and even, without demand. Eliza met his gaze, but she did not answer. The silence between them was not strained. It simply remained, as steady as everything else around her. He studied her for a moment, then asked more gently, "Do you live here?" Again, she did not speak. Not because she would not, but because she could not. Already, she understood what would be required of her. The silence was no longer a possibility. It had become a part of the path that she had chosen. The king's expression shifted slightly, not toward suspicion, but toward curiosity. There was no fear in her, no confusion, no plea, only a calm steadiness that did not match the wildness of the place. His gaze moved briefly toward the cave, toward the gathered nettles at the beginnings of her work, and then he returned to her. "You're not lost?" he said. It was not a question. Eliza held his gaze. After a moment, he spoke again. "Well, you cannot remain here," he said gently. "The forest is not a place to live alone." She did not move. The king seemed to understand something then, not everything, but enough. "You may come with us," he said. There was no command in his voice, only an offering. Eliza turned her gaze briefly toward the deeper forest, toward the places where the nettles grew, toward the work that waited. Then she looked back at him. She gave a small, quiet nod. The king did not press her further. He turned and signaled to one of his men, who brought forward a horse. Eliza stepped forward and mounted with calm, careful movements. She didn't look back, not because she didn't care, but because she had already chosen. The forest would remain, the work would continue, wherever she was taken. And as the riders turned and moved once more through the trees, the light shifted around them, softening into evening, guiding them outward. Eliza rode with them in silence, steady and composed, carrying within her the task she had begun and the promise she would not break. The journey from the forest to the king's castle passed in a calm and steady rhythm. The horses moved along narrow roads that slowly widened as they drew nearer to settled lands. The deep woods gave way to open fields, and fields to small villages where smoke rose gently from chimneys and the scent of bread and wood fire lingered in the air. Eliza rode among them in silence. She did not resist. She didn't question. She remained as she was, quiet, composed, and inwardly turned toward the work she had begun. By the time they reached the castle, evening had begun to fall. The walls rose pale against the dimming sky, their windows catching the light of day. Torches were being lit along the outer gates, their flames moving softly in the cooling air. The great doors opened, and Eliza was brought inside. The castle was warm, ordered, and full of quiet movement. Voices echoed through its halls. Footsteps passed with purpose. Firelight softened the stone walls and flickered across the polished floors. It was a place of structure and safety, of routine and expectation. And yet, for Eliza, it felt distant. Not unkind, but not her own. Servants came to her with care, offering water, clean garments, a place to rest. She accepted all of it with quiet grace. But she didn't speak, not a single word. The king noticed. He didn't press her. Instead, he allowed her silence to remain, watching her with quiet attentiveness that didn't intrude. Days passed. Eliza moved through the castle with the same calm steadiness that she had carried with her in the forest. Her silence didn't feel uncertain. It felt chosen, held carefully in place like something she would not allow to be broken. But others began to notice. At first, it was simple curiosity. A woman found alone in the forest, brought back by the king himself, quiet, composed, and unwilling or unable to explain herself. They watched her. They wondered, and slowly their wondering began to take shape. There was a man in the court who watched more closely than the others. He was not part of the king's household in the ordinary sense. He wore no fine court garments, nor did he carry himself with display. His robes were simple, his manner composed, his presence quiet, but steady. He was a man of the church, and where others observed with curiosity, he observed with judgment. Not harshly, not loudly, with the kind of still certainty that did not easily shift. He saw Eliza's silence. He saw the way she kept apart, and he did not see innocence in it. He saw something hidden. One evening, as the candles were being lit and the castle settled into the softer evening hours, he approached the king. "My lord," he said gently, inclining his head. The king turned to him. "You have taken in a stranger," the man continued. "I have given shelter where it was needed," the king replied. The man inclined his head again. "And yet she does not speak." "No, nor does she offer any account of herself." The king was quiet for a moment. "She has done no harm." The man's expression did not change. "There are those," he said carefully, "whose harm is not easily seen." The words were not sharp, but they lingered. Eliza was given a quiet chamber in the castle. It was simple and removed from the busiest part of the court, and for that she was grateful. There she continued her work. She gathered what she could in small, careful ways, fibers taken from outer grounds, hidden within her garments, carried back in silence. It was not enough, but it was something. And so she worked. Always she worked. Her hands moved steadily, shaping the rough fibers into thread into something that might one day become the first of the shirts. The man of the cloth continued to watch. He didn't approach her directly. Instead, he observed from a distance. He noticed the way she moved at night, the way she gathered things that others did not use, the strange green fibers she kept hidden, the quiet persistence of her work. And slowly, his concern deepened. One evening, he entered her chamber. Not abruptly, but without announcement. Eliza rose at once. She stood quietly, her hands resting at her sides. He looked around the room. The bed, the small table, the dim light of a single candle. And then, the fibers. He stepped closer. He reached out, lifting a strand between his fingers. "What is this?" he asked. Eliza didn't answer. She couldn't. The silence settled between them. He studied her. Longer this time. More carefully. "You will not speak?" he said. Eliza lowered her gaze silently. Not in guilt, not in fear, but in acceptance of what must be. The man's expression remained composed, but something within it shifted. After that, the quiet watching became something more defined. Less curiosity, more certainty. The small observations that had once been harmless began to gather weight. She does not speak. She works in secret. She was found alone. She gathers strange plants. The words moved softly through the court, never spoken loudly, but repeated often enough that they began to settle into belief. The man returned to the king. "My lord," he said, "I would ask that you consider what you have brought into your home." The king's expression did not harden, but it grew more serious. "She has done nothing to deserve suspicion." "Not yet," the man replied gently, "but there are signs that should not be ignored." The king did not answer at once, and in that pause, something began to shift. Not trust, but certainty. Eliza felt it, not as something loud, but as something present, in the way voices softened when she entered a room, in the way glances lingered, in the way the air itself seemed to hold a quiet question around her. Still, she did not stop. She worked when she could. She gathered what little she was able, and she shaped the fibers slowly, steadily, without haste. The first shirt had begun, rough, uneven, but real. At night, when the castle grew still and the last candles burned low, Eliza would pause for only a moment. She would lift her head and listen. Beyond the walls, beyond the quiet, there, faintly, the sound of wings, her brother's, passing somewhere in the darkness above. She did not go to the window. She didn't call out. She returned to her work. The days moved forward. The thread grew. The silence deepened. And though the world around her began to turn uncertain, Eliza remained steady, unmoved in her purpose, unbroken in her resolve. She would finish what she had begun, no matter how she was seen, no matter what was believed, no matter what would come. She would finish. The days that followed did not slow. If anything, they seemed to move more quickly, as though time itself had begun to gather and press forward towards something already waiting. Within her chamber, Eliza worked. The first shirt had taken shape, rough and uneven, its threads imperfect, its form not yet what it needed to be, but it held. It was real. And once it was finished, she did not pause long before beginning the next. Her hands had changed. The sting of the nettles no longer startled her. It came and settled, sharp at first, then fading into a steady warmth that lived beneath her skin. Her fingers grew more certain in her movements. The fibers obeyed her more readily. The threads held together longer. Still, the work was slow, always slow, and always requiring more. Outside her chamber, the quiet unease with the court had begun to take a firmer shape. The man of the cloth spoke more often now with the king, his voice never raised, never harsh, but steady and unyielding in its concern. "She keeps herself apart," he said one evening. "She works in secret. She gathers things that are not meant for use within these walls." The king listened. "She has harmed no one," he replied. "Not all harm is seen in its beginning," the man said. The words settled heavily between them. And though the king did not agree, he no longer dismissed what was being said. Eliza felt the shift, not in a single moment, but in many small ones. The way the servants lingered less, the way conversations ended when she entered, the way the air itself seemed to hold a quiet judgment that had not been seen before. Still, she didn't stop. She worked when she could. She gathered what little she was able. She shaped the fibers, thread by thread, until the second shirt began to take form beside the first. Time passed. The third shirt began, then the fourth. Each one came more quickly than the last, though never easily. Her hands bore the marks of her labor, reddened, worn, and yet steady. At night, when the castle lay quiet, she would sometimes pause, lifting her head slightly, listening for the distant sound of wings. They came, always faint, always far, but enough. Enough to remind her that she was not working alone in the world, even if she stood alone in that room. Then one evening, the quiet tension within the court broke. Eliza had gone, as she sometimes did, beyond the walls of the castle to gather what she needed. The outer grounds had long since been stripped of what she required, and so she had walked further, into the shadowed places where the nettles still grew. She moved carefully, quickly, but without haste. Her hands worked as they always did. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her, not at first, but when she rose, her arms full of gathered nettles, she saw them, men, watching. Their expressions were uncertain, but not kind. One stepped forward. "What are you doing?" he asked. Eliza did not answer. She could not. The man's gaze moved to the plants in her hands, the marks upon her skin. to the silence she held, and something in his expression changed. She was brought back to the castle, not roughly, but not gently either. Word spread quickly. It moved through the halls, through the servants' quarters, through the court itself, gathering as it went, shaping itself into something more certain with each telling. She was found gathering strange plants in the dark. She would not speak. She hides her work. She refuses to answer. By the time the story reached the great hall, it had become something heavier. The man of the cloth stood before the king. "My lord," he said, "it can no longer be set aside." The king's face was troubled. "She has given no cause." "She has given every cause," the man replied, still calm, still certain. "Silence where there should be truth, secrecy where there should be openness, work that is hidden and done apart from all others." The king looked away, and for the first time, he did not defend her. Eliza was brought forward. She stood in the great hall, the gathered court around her, the weight of their attention settling quietly upon her shoulders. The king looked at her. There was no anger in his gaze, only something heavier, something uncertain. "If there is truth, you would speak," he said gently. "Now is the time." Eliza met his eyes. She said nothing. She could not. The silence that followed was deeper than any that had come before. The decision was made, not in anger, not in haste, but in the slow, certain way that things are decided when doubt has settled too deeply to be undone. She would be condemned, not with cruelty, but with finality. Eliza was returned to her chamber, the door closed, and for the first time since she had begun, she was left entirely alone. No footsteps in the hall, no quiet movement beyond the door, only stillness and time, what little of it remained. She didn't weep, she didn't falter. She went to her work. The shirts lay before her. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The 11th lay unfinished, the fibers still rough, the thread not yet complete. Her hands moved, faster now, but still steady, always steady. The sting had long since become something she no longer noticed. Only the work remained, only the promise. Morning came, soft, pale, unstoppable. She was led from her chamber. The air outside was cool, touched with the first light of day. The sky had begun to brighten, though the sun had not yet risen. The court gathered, not loudly, not cruelly, but with a quiet weight that filled the space. Eliza walked among them, calm, silent. Her hands held what she had made, 10 shirts, and one, still unfinished. She was brought forward, the moment held, still. And then, from above, a sound. Wings, at first faint, then nearer, then filling the air itself. The court looked upward. The sky seemed to move. White forms descended through the morning light. Swans. 11. Eliza did not hesitate. She stepped forward. One by one, she cast the shirts over them. The first, the second, the third. Each one fell into place. Each one broke the spell it touched. Forms shifted. Wings became arms. Feathers fell away. Her brothers stood again, restored, returned. The last swan descended. Eliza held the final shirt, not yet complete. For a single moment, she stilled. Then she placed it over him. The change came, but not fully. One arm remained a wing, white, unchanged, the youngest. The silence broke. Eliza drew breath. And at last, she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was soft but clear. She told them everything: the forest, the curse, the work, the silence, the promise she had kept. The truth settled over the court slowly, but completely, until there was no doubt left. The king stepped forward. The weight in his gaze had changed. No longer uncertainty, no longer distance, only understanding, only sorrow for what had nearly been lost. In the days that followed, the story of what had been endured spread quietly through the kingdom, and what had once been doubt gave way to understanding. The king had seen her steadfastness, even in silence, asked Eliza to remain, not as a stranger within his halls, but as one who belonged there. And in time, without haste or display, she became his queen. It was not a change marked by celebration alone, but by a quiet settling of all that had once been certain. The place that had nearly cast her out now held her fully, and no voice within it could turn against her again. Her brothers remained near, no longer bound to the sky, their lives restored and steady beside her. And the world, which had once felt fragile and shifting, grew calm. Not perfect, but certain and safe. The morning light rose, the air softened, and the world which had held its breath seemed to at last release it. Eliza stood among those she loved, no longer alone, no longer silent. The work was finished, the promise kept, and there was peace. And now the castle grows quiet once more. The great halls once filled with voices and uncertainty settle into gentle stillness. The firelight softens along the stone walls, and the long corridors rest beneath the hush of the evening. Outside, the night has come softly over the fields and forest. The wind moves through the trees in a low, steady whisper, and the lake lies still beneath the moonlight, as though it too remembers what has passed. The wings that once crossed the sky each night are quiet now. The long work is finished. The shirts have been woven. The silence has been lifted. And the promise, held so carefully through every trial, has been kept. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, the forest remains as it always has, deep and watchful, holding its old paths and quiet secrets, but its shadows no longer feel uncertain. They simply are. And here, within the safety of the castle, a sister rests at last among her brothers, no longer bound by silence, no longer alone in her burden. The long nights have passed, the waiting has ended, and all that was once fragile has settled into something steady and sure. The candles burn low, the air grows still, and the whole kingdom drifts gently toward rest. So now, let the story grow quiet and fade into the night. Sleep now. You are safe. You are loved. You have been listening to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories, written and created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.